Hello, everybody. This is the seventh session of the Unordinary Bible study. Once again, this is a partnership collaboration with the Active Inference Institute. And so I'm going to give some disclaimers about what these sessions are about. And then we're going to lead into like a dialogue, contemporary mostly contemporary philosophy focused discussion where we bring up certain talking points that come to our minds, and then we relate. A lot of the time, at least, I'll bring some talking points up, and then I'll go back to scripture in the Old or New Testament. But this is not restricted to talking about the Bible. That's just kind of my comfort zone in a way because of my upbringing and what I'm familiar with and just how I relate things in terms of uh, uh, thinking about spirituality and religion and what that means to me and how that impacts my mindset. But I'm not. That's not. Whatever. However, people, especially involved in these conversations, want to express their talking points. You don't have to go to scripture per se if you don't want to. I know I'm going to bring up a number of Bible verses throughout the session, but so that should be enough to work with. But and additional disclaimer is I'm not a subject matter expert, and even though there are there tends to be at least one or two other people with doctorate degrees on this call. I mean, I'm not going to point out who it is, but there is one other person on this call who is a doctorate. But just a disclaimer is most of us we're not experts in seminary studies, and we're not proclaiming to be an authority on talking about scripture or how to interpret a point of view in terms to your what it your point of view in the world as somebody of faith, whether you're Christian or you're Jewish. I think it's even though it might not be obvious to some people watching these sessions for some odd reason. I always like to put that disclaimer out there that all these sessions are a friendly dialogue, and we're not proclaiming that our what we how we present our talking points and what we think is the authoritative take. I think, I just want to put that out there. Additionally, just some insight into what the Active Inference Institute is all about, since this is a partnership collaboration that I host through the Institute. So the Active Inference Institute. So getting an idea of what Active Inference is about first is basically it's this framework of understanding that's picked up in cognitive science, particularly a lot of people that specialize in cognitive psychology, and some people in the machine learning community and AI research community have an interest in exploring the utility of active inference theory. And basically, what that's about is perspective of how we perceive and engage with the world around us as agents, because we have this capacity to reflect on decisions we make, and we experience we have experience in the sense that over time, as we're interacting with the world around us and we're making and we are reflecting on different decisions we've made, engaging with the world. So we have this prior history, and then we try and make predictions or posterior estimations about what we ought to do to optimize our engagement with the world around us. So there's this idea of that I brought up known as a generative model as opposed to a generative process, which got more into the last couple sessions, where the generative model has to do with the beliefs, or like how we formulate our understanding of the world around us, but that's limited to perception in the sense of like what information is available to us or our affordances, as opposed to what we can't comprehend, despite the information we have access to, or also known as reality itself. That like despite how we perceive reality and whatever information we have access to, given a lot of literature and philosophy of science, for instance, says that we have this dilemma as bounded reasoners, or this idea of bounded rationality, which is something I've been getting more into in terms of like understanding like how we as agents have this limited access to information, given that we always have an incomplete um, understanding of the world around us, right? So active inference provides motivation for us to make predictions, to make estimations, given that we can't be exact about our understanding of the world around us. So that's really the motivation into how we how why AI and machine learning engineers and researchers have interest in active inferences. It provides motivation for us to build more robust systems that people can better interact with. And on the other hand, the cognitive science community, in particular, a lot of people that focus on the cognitive psychology aspect, gives more intuition into understanding our behavior as well as behavior of other organisms, which, an organism we term as an agent. And in the cognitive science, not cognitive science community necessarily, but in the machine learning and artificial intelligence community, there's these additional terms such as agentic systems or non-agentic systems that's coming up in the literature. Basically, the computers that we interact with aren't alive, so they're non-agentic. While an agentic system would be, for instance, if you've interacted with ChatGPT, right, or Google Gemini, right, you have these systems that give the impression that they have agency, but their capacity to interact, to and that their containment within how they're encoded as basically a piece of software that gives the impression that they are agents, but they're not. So, all right, that's a little bit of a rundown of active inference. And so, given that active inference gives a lot of motivation to understanding human behavior, it also gives motivation into psychology and culture and social structure cohesion, right? And how groups coordinate. So thinking of people who identify with a particular faith, like Christianity or Judaism, like active inference theory can give us insights into understanding what it means to be a person of faith, or be a person that doesn't necessarily identify with a faith, but they might have spiritual beliefs of some sort. So active inference gives us this is a lens, so to speak, that gives that can give us more intuition of like what reasoning, or perhaps there is a way for us to explain what it means to believe in God, or what it means to be a Christian, um, in a more nuanced and appreciable and maybe I don't want to say scholarly manner, but in a manner that seems reasonable and rational, given a lot of pushback that agnostics and atheistic uh, crowds out there, their understanding of what it means to be religious or not religious. So, and this discussion is not a debate. It's more like, we're having this contemporary discussion. So I kind of want to build into first I want to summarize what I went over um, maybe the last two sessions. With this lens of active inference, we can say that the focus of how can we have some how can we start a discussion about what it means, what does God mean, and how does that lead into a conversation about Christianity and having a Bible study. So let me open up my notes here. So I guess I've been working on more simply boiling this down. I remember that I opened our last session saying that the focus of this session today is going to be getting into we're going to talk about what the gospel means, and how that's different as opposed to referring to the gospels in particular, because like I said, my comfort zone is going into the Bible, so it's sort of a personal preference. But we're going to get into that today. Where did I put it? Give me a second. Because I know I recited it last time. Okay, here I remember I put it in a different card. Okay, here we go. So, and I'm gonna give a better, I think I have a more appropriate framing for this, but for my interpretation of what God means to me, and I like the way I phrase this, so I'm just gonna reiterate it one more time. Even though I mentioned it in the last session, but basically, God is the ensemble of convergent possibility states pertaining to acting in good faith, as opposed to evil, which is the antithesis ensemble of acting in good faith. The omniscient or all knowing part has to do with the ensemble network of all possibility states contingent on prior and posterior aligned trajectories of the agent in question based on the conduction of their actions. You can talk about God not as a being of being, but just as an entire network of all possibilities, but those possibilities must converge to good faith acting of agents. God is about symbiotic accountability of conscience aware agent based coordination. And then I made these interesting tidbits on a couple Clubhouse chats this week. So I'm going to build on that with a couple tidbits I want to share. The capacity to harness knowledge is contingent upon how humans as agents are capable of generating and augmenting natural language systems, which then builds on how agents optimize coordination capacities to preserve group as well as individual fitness. Then the conception of God emerges from natural language semantic structure cohesion. God is also not an agent, but contingent upon group actionable outcomes of human-like agents as symbiotic optimal outcomes of group and ecological trade-offs. God being omnipotent does not necessarily mean he can do anything, in my view. I think omnipotence has to do with the exhaustive good faith acting outcomes that can arise from group actions of human like agents. Good and evil only applies to humans or human like agents. So, um, in this sense, I'm basically saying God is this capacity uh, for conscience aware agents to coordinate in a manner that preserves each other's autonomy, but is also mindful of the ecological dynamics involved. So how we treat our individual as well as our group impact on the world around us, essentially. But I like to say that God is the potential of goodness, even though that it is a bit vague, because then I have to add more specificity to the matter and say, well, God, what is the potential of goodness, right? And like a physicist might ask me, well, like how do you quantify this, right? Well, if you're familiar with what a field is, right, you're like thinking about all the different outcomes that could take place. Like if I am throwing a ball up in the air, right, and I change the angle that I throw the ball, and how that the parabolic arc that's shown in those free body diagrams in your old high school physics textbooks or science books, right? The quadratic equation that, well, they use the quadratic formula to kind of generalize this, but if you change the angle of the ball, that parabola, the shape of it changes, right? And all the different, if you plot all the different shapes, like if you plot all those different trajectories on, like if you outline them on top of each other, right? All each one of those out, like layered on you see all those layers of the angle of the parabola, of the shape of the parabola, all of that. We could call that the field. We could say, okay, this is the field, right? That based on like every way I could throw the ball and what the outcome's going to be, that's going to be my field. So this potential of good, the goodness potential of good faith acting, right? You can think of this as a field, right? And the exhaustive outcomes that can arise from how we coordinate as good faith actors, is kind of like manifest. This is how God manifests in humans, right? Or you could say how in the biblical context, man is created. This is the implication of what is meant by saying man is created in the image of God, if that makes sense. Now, there's a couple points I want to get into. One being that from the Old Testament and the New Testament perspective, before we get into the dialogue, a couple things I want to say is from the Old Testament perspective, right? There's this so the variation between the Old Testament and the New Testament is one, the most commonly brought up distinction between the Old Testament and the New Testament, or if you were to say Judaism as opposed to Christianity in that sense, not in the most broad sense, but like if we were to say, if we take what is understood from interpreting just the Old Testament as opposed to New Testament, right? It would be this the being explicit about the problem of evil necessarily. It is the most that's the biggest distinction, that the problem of evil, this capacity for humans to deceive themselves, essentially, like if we think of good and evil being on a spectrum of extremity, right, where good is on one end and evil is on the other, right? um so we can think of it that way. So the problem of good and evil is, I don't want to say taken for granted, in the Old Testament interpretation, but it's implicit. The problem with evil is implicit. I mean, we see different stories like the Cain and Abel story. So a lot of stories that are largely popularized in Genesis in the Old Testament, right? Um, so the Cain and Abel story, the story, in Genesis 23, of course, the moment where Abraham is challenged regarding his son Isaac, where he doesn't actually kill his son, and then you can have a whole conversation about what is actually meant here. Was Abraham challenged, or what, by God, or was, that the devil, communicating as if it was God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. So there's an interesting spin you can say here. You can also say it is God challenging him. But now, what's interesting about me bringing up Genesis 23 and the story of Abraham being challenged about his son Isaac, has to do with how conscience dynamics plays a role here, where, um, when somebody is challenged regarding what they ought to do or not do, right? Like based on the circumstances they're in, and all of a sudden they have this decision, this ensemble of thoughts and making a decision playing out, right? It's as if they're talking to some underdimensional being, or maybe there is, maybe it is God, in the sense of that we could take literally, but we don't. We can take it from an interpretive point of view here, from a psychological. What I like to, not to say that it is the Jordan Peterson spin on psychological archetypes, but I guess from the popular, um, from the popularized point of view of like how we can go through scripture and relate psychologically and circumstantially our lives to the biblical context. Jordan Peterson is probably among the most popular. But the Genesis 23 story is certainly like this, this battle with our conscience, what we ought to or ought to not do, what is the right thing given a circumstance that we're in. And another big story, that is in the New Testament as opposed to the Old Testament, has to do with the book of Job. So the life of Job and what Job went through. So, but that's kind of like revealing a dichotomy there, that both in the book of Job and also Genesis 23, we can say that the interaction between God and the and the biblical character in context, whether it's Job, whether it's one of the disciples, right? It's boiling down to whether it's, a personal, reflective conscience, in terms of, whether it's personal self-reflection on, okay, should I do or not do, and what is right or wrong at a given moment in time, and how I'm reflecting over that process. And we can put ourselves in the shoes of the characters being portrayed, whether it's in the Old or the New Testament, right? So the book of Job being one example, going through Genesis in the Old Testament. So whether it's story of Cain and Abel as one example, or whether another popular example being the story of Abraham and his son Isaac at the time where Abraham is challenged. And but we don't have to take this interpretation literally, is what I mean. Not that I have a problem with how literal someone interprets um, these um, these different depictions. But what's ever more interesting, though, again, is how we can put our own, how we can relate to the narrative as it plays out in scripture, right? So how we relate to each passage, right? Um, so that's what I mean by saying, well, I find the psychological archetypes approach interesting, and it's a shame that sometimes when I talk to the Calvinists on Clubhouse, for example, or even some atheists, they're kind of dismissive of, oh, well, you're just talking about the psychological archetypes, you're just anthropomorphizing it. But it's like, well, it's more complicated than that, because like ultimately, if we are to go to the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, for instance, right? Or we could go to the book of Daniel, and there's a couple other books in the Old Testament too, right? Not to have bias for the Old and New Testament, but if we talk about the Tower of Babel story, for instance, right, we could see how like perhaps one of the perennial issues about humanity being a potential Achilles heel is the whole Tower of Babel story, where um, we develop all this sophistication through how we structure society and interact with each other. And then we can get so focused on toppling everything and not not being more mindful about how we structure the layers of each social convention in terms of how different uh, subject matter experts from different disciplines engage with each other and come up with insights. Because, for instance, there's a lot of problems with interdisciplinary interaction. Um, not only in the scientific community, but I mean we're seeing a lot of problems from even if we're talking about the market, right? You have different players in the market trying to cooperate with each other. There's a lot of problems there, right? So thinking about finance as opposed to tech, as opposed to agriculture, and you could keep going and going and going, right? And the food and the food service industry. How are these different uh, players in the market related? How can they interact with each other? Or thinking about how different people of different backgrounds can have a conversation relates to the problem that's brought up largely in Revelation regarding the Tower of Babel story. So I think these are some interesting talking points to consider. Now, what I wanted to get into a little bit today. Somebody brought up some talking points when I brought up the Bible study session I'm hosting today. So a couple interesting talking points I want to get into today. For those of you, uh, I don't know how many. I think Sam and Kasni um, are Christian, but I don't know about Harlequin, right?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So how you identify, right? I'm trying to identify myself as a Christian. I'd call myself like sort of like a postmodernist, but also like I take a lot of inspiration from Christianity. I tend to go to my local synagogue and church services. But it's interesting because I feel like there's a lot, especially that I get from a sermon that I can relate to. psychologically, and then I spin that into the sessions I have and a lot of the dialogues I have about um, especially the organization that I intern at, where I'm hosting these studies. There's a lot of interesting dialogue we can have about how we can think about agents and especially human, like how we as humans better understand how we ought to engage with each other and the world around us. But okay, so all right, so I want to talk a little bit about. Um, I know we talked a bit about, and maybe these are talking points we can get into later. Um, about okay, so let's start with what the gospel represents, as opposed to the gospels. That's a talking point that I've been motivated about as of recently. Now, my spin on the gospel has to do with as we try and interpret the lives, like how the lives of the disciples are carried out, and how that dynamic plays out, and how we see Christ um, engaging with the common folk and the kinds of um, uh, different moments that he engages with his disciples. Like, what do we get from that, right? Like, and how does that ultimately relate to our lives, and how it motivates us throughout the course of our life, right? And, like what, and it's in the sense of like, okay, well, the journey of the disciples and Christ is in some sense very relatable to our personal journeys and our struggle in our lives and how we're persecuted, and our ebbs and flows in terms of the things that we look the things that um you know things that we how our accomplishments, what those accomplishments mean, and thinking about, well, we ought to reflect on how that lead how we can be at peace with being honest with ourselves and how we conduct ourselves. So, like, being reflecting on the moments that we make decisions in our lives, and how we carry ourselves. And this kind of leads into what many Christians talk about as salvation. It's like how do we salvage, or how can we be at peace with ourselves in terms of um, how we are engaging with each other and the world around us. So that's how I would um, that's my big take from the gospel, is that it's this personal and interpersonal journey that we're having in our lives, where at the end of the day we come to a crossroads, and we have to be honest with, like, it's like, okay, well, how am I, what's my impact? Um, and is it a good impact, that I have on my own well-being, on the well-being of others, and being more mindful of what's happening in the world around me, right? This idea of salvation is being at peace with how I carry myself, given those, uh, given that, I have to be mindful of how I how I treat others, myself, and the world around, right? So that's in a nutshell, I would say that's what we get out of the gospel, as opposed to the gospels um, it would, the gospels would just be the main books that refer to the gospel story, right? So we're talking about Matthew, Luke, John, there's a couple other ones I can't name off the top of my head, um, but um, but yeah, let's start with that. If you guys are comfortable with that, I kind of been going on a tangent, but I'll let you guys share what you want to say. I don't know if Kasni or Harlequin, if you guys have anything to share about like what your view of the gospel is as opposed to the gospels, or whether or not like if it just makes sense for you to talk about the gospel as opposed to the gospels, or maybe you can interrelate them.
That's the thing. I'm having a hard time understanding. What's the main question?
What do you get out of the gospel? You know, like the whole journey of Christ as he guides his disciples, right? And um how that plays out. Like what do you
From
get out of
what
that?
perspective? Is it a Christian perspective? Is it a scholarly perspective?
I
Because
guess
what were you gonna say?
yeah, I guess you can like give you know what like you could go if there's different ways you want to lay it out based on those differing perspectives. Feel free to kind of go through them, unless you have like something that sticks real well to you that like you're saying you have different ways of interpreting it, or there's a specific way that you interpret it. I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Uh, Recently I've tried my very best to read at least one book, Bible book per month. And I think so far I've read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I'm getting ready to finish with some of the other ones. As I read it, the first thing I notice is that it's a roadmap stating that if he can, we can too. As in, if Jesus can, he's human, well, half human, half God, if you want to say that. And if he's able to live according to God's will, so can we. To me, I think the main message that we get is that it's exactly what's stated in the Ten Commandments. We have the first five that talks about loving God and only one God. And we have the next five, which talks about loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. And even though the gospel focuses on different rules, specifically the ones that were highlighted in the Old Testament, I think the main focus of it has to do with loving one another. There's one example in particular I saw where I forgot which book, I'd have to go back to it. You had the 12 disciples who were the main individuals that God was saying to go and spread his message, right? And I think at one point they noticed that there were other individuals also spreading the message. And they came to him saying, how come these people are also speaking about you? They're not a disciple. And his response was, the purpose of all of us being here is to spread the good news so that we can all be informed and make better decisions to enter heaven. And so I think it's all those things that are included in the story, but that's only from a Christian perspective. You'd have to ask me another question as it relates to a scholarly perspective.
Yeah, you could go through each of that was interesting. You could share the other ones too. I'm curious.
This is the thing, I'm not necessarily too sure. When I read the Bible, I'm not using my scholarly mind. I'm mostly just taking it in as what is, what happened, and the word that it is.
Okay.
Now I can scrutinize it, but I think I need a little bit of help with that. What's the question?
Yeah, so yeah, from a scholarly so that could be a tongue twister sometimes. Um I guess it's interesting. So what you're saying, like from a college, from some what you're saying by like giving the scholarly perspective is that having that confidence that you know what the scholars are saying and you can summarize it from their point of view as opposed to your interpretation. But ultimately, I think one of the problems I'm finding, and I'm starting to meet some scholars on Clubhouse, there is one theologian that I've sort of been talking to. Um, there's another one that's a Calvinist that I haven't had much interaction with, but it seems like they have a classical view as opposed to my point of view, which is kind of more on building on the psychological uh, dynamics of interpreting scripture. And I think there's this problem um, that I don't think I've really gotten into this issue on the previous sessions, that there's this problem of a linguistic formalism, like this linguistic interpretive convention of scripture. And I think there's a problem there because there's different authorities. There's denominational authority, there's denominations, and there's authorities that are associated. There's authority figures associated to each of the denominations, but none of it seems that none of the particular main authorities or denominations necessarily have some formally rigorously demonstrated interpretation, rather than just sort of like a perspective spin that has some literal or um, there's an interpretation there that's not evaluated in a semantic in a very rigorous semantic sense, I would say, right? So this is what I find interesting from the postmodernist crowd. So if you I do recommend checking out Jay McDaniel and Thomas J. Ord. I would have I need to look more into their works, but these are two examples of postmodern scholars. Um, and it seems like they're kind of in alignment from what from what I've gathered so far, because I've watched the Brendan Graham Dempsey interviews of Jay McDaniel and Thomas J. Ord. And based on that interview and compare it, based on those interviews I saw and comparing that with Jordan Peterson's spin on the psychological archetypes uh, framing of scripture, it seems like there could be an interesting pushback from the scholarly community, um, maybe from the cognitive theology side. There might be something going on there. There's a book out called How God Changes Your Brain. It's a little bit dated back in 2014. Andrew Newberg is one of the main authors. He's an agnostic, though. The other person that co-authored the book with him, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but this piece gets into sort of the dynamics of like what parts of the brain are involved when it comes to framing beliefs, like spiritual beliefs and how we engage with the world around us, right? So like, this is like kind of getting into like the different parts of the brain and how the different regions are how they're engaging with each other, and what that has to do with the spiritual experience. That's what that book, and it's a little bit dated, so I didn't complete reading it. It's a little bit dated. There is more recent literature I've found, but basically, um, from the neurotheology side of things, um, it's it, there's this understanding of okay, well, what parts of the brain are most active and are relevant to spiritual beliefs. And then on the other hand, from like the psychology side and the what may be kind of unraveling from the cognitive theology side is kind of like what I brought up earlier about this generative model framing of like how beliefs are framed based on culture and what the cultural associations have to do uh, with our psychological what's going on psychologically, how we function as individuals, as opposed to how we identify and work with groups of individuals, right? So, but and from there, I think there, you know, I argue that there's this converging leaning towards that. Okay, what we get is this altruistic perspective of like how we ought to, you know, how we, you know, this you know, leaning towards mindfulness and how we can do good for the world around us and each other. But
Jesse, can
again,
I jump in? Can I ask you if you would take modally, like operationally, acting in the spirit, acting as Christ, you take that as like altruism? Is that kind of where we're at as far as
oh, okay, I'm
like
glad
if
you
I could just
bring that
characterize?
up. I think I'm glad you bring that up. That's going
Yeah,
to
and
get a
that's not to
little off
impose my
track.
view. It's just I'm just really trying to ask if that's what you would sort of liken one to the other. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to get that in a moment. But from the scholarly side, it doesn't seem quite, I don't think there's much actual commitment to a rigorous exploration of what God means in relation to society, psychology, the neurobiology, and reflecting on what it actually is doing to human behavior. So I think I think it's really an uncertain take from the scholarly community at large, especially because it's sort of like uh, I guess talking about religion in the scientific community is sort of a taboo too, in a sense. So it makes it hard to have these scholarly talks. But in a nutshell, from the scholarly side, there's this investigation of what's going on in our brains, what's going on with our behavior, um, how we coordinate with each other and our surroundings. But the way that plays out is in the sense of like talking, you know, framing altruism, as Harlequin was bringing up, like framing the effective altruist mindset or honest effect, you know, like having a different spin on effective altruism because there are a number of communities now that are giving pushback against effective altruism, right? So you can't just say, oh, well, maybe that we can have this framing towards effective altruism, but then you argue that people that say, you know, there's hypocrisy afoot about how people practice their faith, especially if it pertains to people that identify in the scholarly crowd. So that's what I'll say about the scholarly framing is that there's different denominational authorities, and even in different seminaries, there's leanings towards denominational authorities and um, how seminaries prop up different perspectives and put out literature that gives an argument for an apologetic point of view. Now, I will say from the postmodern side, that's it's not really that well known. So even when I talk to theologians on Discord, they don't know who Jay McDaniel is. They don't know who they barely know who John Vervaeke is. I mean, you know, if I ask, um, you might not know this particular person, but one theologian on his name is Zeleny on Clubhouse doesn't seem very familiar with John Vervaeke. You know, I don't think he ever looked into his work. You know, so there's a problem with the scholarly community that the classical scholarly community has no idea what's going on from the postmodern side. They're completely dismissive. And it's a shame. And there's this lack of linguistic analysis of not just Christianity, the Bible, but the Quran and other faiths. So that's what I'll say is that the scholarly perspective is a hot mess. I don't want to say, oh, it's leaning towards this way and that way, but if I had to give a framing for the scholarly side, and I'm Kazni, I don't remember you said there was one more perspective lens that you felt like you couldn't give credence to. I wasn't sure. Did I cover my bases?
Yeah, I think just those two, Christian perspective as well as a scholarly perspective. But all I was
Uh-huh.
saying to the second one is that you'd have to ask me a question for me to be able to say, do I agree? Do I disagree? Have I questioned this, or why do I believe that?
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Now Harlequin, you can you ask me that what you said that builds on altruism, or you said something about how like we relate to Christ or living in a Christ-like way. I forgot.
Jesse, not if you're not going to listen. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, Jesse, I was really just asking, and I apologize if the interruption was just maybe not the best timed, but I was just asking what your perspective was as far as if you would kind of more or less, or with any caveat, like say something like effective altruism is equivalent to, like modally speaking, identifying as Christ, like when we act in accordance with Christ, which of course extends from that the idea that like you're acting in accordance with God the Father, if you believe that.
Mhm.
But even just to focus on Christ as like a modality or a method, a mode of being, even like
Uh,
would you kind of look at that as more or less equivalent to effective altruism?
I think Christ represents the most, the best example, like setting the best example is basically like what it means. But the problem being that we're imperfect agents, right? We are limited to bounded rationality, right? Like we don't have complete access to all of understanding all of reality and all that stuff, right? There's all these problems with having a full understanding of what it means to experience the world, right? Because there's always hidden detail, there's hidden variation amongst our perception, right? And so it clouds our capacity to make the most quote unquote perfect decisions. But I will say that Christ has to to act in a Christ-like way is to basically have a quality of making an honest commitment to making the most optimal decision in some point of time. Like you're kind of you're basically reflecting on like not necessarily like what would Jesus do, but like you think of like you consider relating back to the gospel, right? In terms of like, okay, well, how did Jesus carry himself amongst the common folk and how he engaged with his disciples, and you build on that in a sense of like,
Can I
okay,
stop you there just because I do really appreciate your explanation. I
uh,
was really just wondering about altruism because if we're trying to talk about like what it means to act as Christ, I think like you could look at something like effective altruism as like a good lump of clay or a good lump of dough to start working with. Absolutely. Because I think it's necessary to have something to be working with there. Now, as far as like when you say, as you're saying now, like relating to the Gospels and upon relating to the Gospels, like we have this like idea of what it would mean to identify in Christ, effectively what that would mean as far as how we're relating to our environment, to one another, et cetera, so forth, even ourselves, right? I'm on board with you, but I mean, certainly you wouldn't say that, like, so I guess maybe let me just ask you this. Maybe I should just let you finish, but I'm wanting to jump in because so much of what you're saying is so compelling, both of you really. Um, Well, I'll do this. I'll eat my own medicine, right? And I'll actually put a lump of clay on the table to work with. But you tell me if it's overstepping. So certainly you're not trying to say that like one relates to the Gospels as a means to act like Christ, right? Because I think in a lot of ways, when Christ compels us, it is compelling us uh, on a level that, as it's written. I was there in the beginning. I'll just, take that out of, I'll pull that out of my rear end. But I think what we're talking about here is this empathetic nature that we as people innately have. I think when we look at, would you not, help your friend, your family get their ass out of the hole, even if it was the Sabbath? I feel as though what Jesus, who I think we experience in the narrative, in the ancient Near Eastern narrative, and how we learn about this modal Christ. When Jesus is saying this, assuming he did, I think we're being compelled to reference something that's already in us. Wouldn't you do X, Y, Z? Would you not help your friend? Because there's something in us that would say, you know what, even if it is the Sabbath, I have a higher understanding of what one needs to do in this situation. And I think that it's speaking to just that kind of empathetic, social um, resolve that we all have, if that makes any sense. But so I'm wondering, just what do you think about that? What do you think as far as, do you think it's something we innately do have, which isn't to say, we do it on our own. I know I don't have to speak to you as though you're a fundamentalist, but I think it's, well, I've said enough. I'll pass it back to you. And if that didn't make sense, if you need clarification on anything, please let me know. But I'd be very curious to know what you think.
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is like that like Christ represents what I like to call the ideal of how how should I carry myself, as to how did I carry myself, or so on and so forth. So um and we can also say, well, there's not just one optimal way to handle a given situation, but there could be many different ways, right? But um, we could say that Christ, a Christ-like way to act just means that we carry ourselves at a certain particular moment in a way that is in alignment with like how we approach a circumstance honestly and humbly. So as long as you're
Well, so
doing
when I when
that,
I when I look at Christ sat with people, I take that as, like, among other things, where you're removing the obstruction. You pick up your cross, you follow after Christ, you do your due diligence. To sit with is to say, even the people that fall outside the bounds of this, like, optics, right? The ways of the world, how they're perceived, the downtrodden, but not just those who did wrong, but in fact lepers who, yeah, you could look at other examples too. No doubt people get written off. And I think when you sit with, you are understanding. So you're actually taking the time to do your due diligence. And then, like you're saying, operating in accordance with what you now know. So now loving this person isn't merely this one size fits all thing, like you kind of alluded to just a moment ago, but it is in fact also adding that layer of, I'm going to also act in accordance with specifically what I know of this person, because that's going to inform me as to how to best love this person. What do you think about that?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And like there's this notion of like bravery too in mind, right? That like you have to realize that maybe a decision that you make might implicate that it might work against your fitness in some way, or maybe you are, how maybe you do get crucified in some, not maybe a literal sense, but like in some sort of metaphor, like psychological metaphorical sense too, right? It's like you do get crucified for doing this thing for this
Certainly, yeah,
person, right?
because right,
Or
they'll
this
hate you in my
community.
name is to say, like, yeah, absolutely, I completely concur.
Yeah, but I think as long as it's like the way you conduct yourself is not selfish, and that you're doing that you are committing your actions and in accordance to like knowing that it's not just like what you stand for and how you carry yourself. It's not just about you, but it's about weighing you know, like who else is involved and like how could my actions matter for
Right.
certain
So like the
yeah.
the humble servant I rode in on a donkey motif, right? Like I take that very much to be kind of like the so you have this idea of empathy. You're relating to your environment, you're relating to the social cultural hierarchy, you're relating to individuals, and God has funneled through those different systems, right? Like I think is modally to recognize, God the Father, God the Spirit, God the Son. I think when we're talking kind of as you said,
Hmm.
as like on an individual basis, primarily relating. I think this is where you have the Christ emerge. Um, but that said, I think like the what would really kind of frame that like because you can say it kind of starts and builds off of this empathy, and then what then would subsequently frame the modality would have to be that motif of the humble servant that rode in on a donkey, the servant who I mean, even as a leader, you're looking at, kind of almost an inversion. Inversion may be the wrong word, but I tend to think of it almost as an inversion on the previous understanding, right? He's not David 2.0. He's a different kind of leader. He's a leader who washes the feet of his disciples. So it's like inversion, I guess, in that kind of sense, because he's serving them. So, and hopefully that was like relevant to what you were building up there. I felt the need to comment.
Yeah, it get that builds into like what makes I'm not better than any other person. Everybody has their own qualities, right? So why should I look down on this person because of
Absolutely.
their role
That
in
supports the whole thing.
society or
Absolutely. That is one of the undergirding principles that absolutely has to support the entire like it's so foundationary what you just said, I feel, because
Mhm.
it's one of the equalizers, right? That we all relate to and why it is also therefore so important that we do, this thing.
It gets me into this conversation about we don't what we don't really care about equality among our peers as much as we do about equity among our peers, right? We care about, we shouldn't, when people talk about equal opportunity, they don't care about people being on a level playing field. They're just going along with buzzwords that are deceiving. What people really should mean is equitable opportunity, meaning that we get access to what we need based on our circumstances and how we operate, not just on, okay, you get $10, I get $10, or whatever. You get exactly the same thing you know what I'm saying? That everybody else gets. You're right. So if that makes sense. So it gets into um, this discussion about, well, should we be talking about what it means to treat each other as equals, or should we look at it as, okay, well, I should look at you based on like how you function and what your needs are and what you can do as opposed to what I can do, right? And appreciate that, and meet you there, not just being like, okay, I'm looking at you as a human, I'm a human, because it's more interesting than that. It's more appreciable
It's
than
an
that.
added layer, right? It's an added
Yeah.
dimension, an added facet, because I think the truth would have to just be some reconciliation of like both your or like you're oscillating between one and the other because both hold truths. Both are
Uh-huh.
informative and meaningful. Like because we can look at certain expectations that we find virtuous that become meaningful when you look at it democratically, and there's certain I certainly think like the idea of fairness comes into play, but like
Hmm.
when you also then scrutinize and you get down on the level of the individual, that also is meaningful, right? For the whole, for the group. So it's yeah, I completely hear what you're saying. This added dimension and this and then relating like the individual, that notion, relating that to the notion of the group. Like there's emergence like of information there that like is meaningful. I'd say that tells us about ourselves, which I think like we're still like cultivating even like now to this day we're still cultivating. And I think the other reason I wanted to bring this up, this idea of oscillating from one to the other, is because it's like we have differences, right? We could say we all have differences. You look at something like people in completely different, parts of the world. Um, we're human, so arguably we share far more in common than we do that separates us. And when you just look at it through that lens, through that perspective, you can still hold that there are differences, distinct, real differences. It's just a way to contextualize it such that you don't have to, for example, war over those differences. You can instead, like, almost, and forgive the cheese, but you can celebrate them, right? Does that make sense? So it's very much a perspective shift, just as it is, I think, like a paradigm shift, from eye for an eye, instead I'm going to show you grace, this radical break from one norm into this other space. I don't know. If that might sound a bit wooey, I apologize, but it is what it is.
Oh, sorry, I almost forgot I was on mute. Yeah, for some reason I was thinking like, getting back to like, okay, like it's not just about me treating you as a human and you treating me as a human because we're both human, right? But it gets a little deeper, and for some reason, and maybe Kazni brought this up in our last session. I like this group of verses in John, John 8 verses 4 through 7. Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses. Oh, hold on one second. Okay. I think I missed a verse here. Okay. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. So this is verse 3. So this is verses 3 through 7 in John 8. So John 8, verses 3 through 7. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. So I thought that was interesting. And nobody in that story, of course, nobody threw a stone. So they just walked away. They just kind of let it be. So that's kind of how the story goes. But for
Are
some
you familiar
reason,
with the common apologetic, the common, like, more evangelical or fundamentalist apologetic that seeks to correct, anyone that dare promote the hippy dippy Jesus? Are you familiar with what I'm getting at?
um,
The idea that,
we
like, he's not doing it just to simply spare her, as if to say, none of you have a right to judge this person. It's more that, like, according to the law, like, you have to have, like, you have to have so and so present, and you have to do it in such and such a manner. And they were essentially operating out of accordance with that manner. And so that was why he was chastising them. Are you familiar with that apologetic? Or I guess apologetic's not the right word, but that interpretation.
um I guess like I kind of see where that's coming from. Like the way I
I don't
look
know
at
how I
it.
feel about it, but I was just wondering if, yeah, if you'd heard that, because I hear it these days more so sort of like as a means to rebuke somebody who's like as if it's like I often hear it as though to correct people, offering some anachronism when they imply, oh, Jesus is saying don't judge. And I think that it misses the forest for the trees when they do employ that kind of interpretation, because I do very much think that regardless of whether or not he was rebuking them for some operating out of accord or out of efficacy, I think it still stands to that, like, the idea that they shouldn't judge this woman, right? I mean, it still holds true, the principle, I guess. But I think it's because there's a fundamental resurgence of, like, that tries to, like, defeat hippy dippy Jesus and tries to, like, they want judgment, right? Those that have hatred in their heart. I think it's like kind of a spoiled, like, Christian movement, right? Like, if that makes sense.
Um,
like an acroptic agent within modern Christianity. Well, so I'm actually from I actually stand vehemently against Christianity as an institution.
mhm.
And that's like one of the reasons why is I think that like it's just about keeping things in order and the managing and mitigation of like that sort of like coherency, but like they've long since like lost the plot because you know well, let's get into a whole other like I mean, you look at someone like Peter. Peter, he was the guy, right? But he also denied Christ 3 times, right? I'm going to build my church upon this rock. This guy is the guy, but he faltered. And I think it's to say that it's an elusive thing, right? Why did Jesus speak in parables, right? Because it's an elusive thing, but it's an engaging thing, right? And this brings us back to the idea of empathy. That's why when people are moved, excuse me, when they're moved to Christ, it's often this like emotional thing because it's on a deeper level. They're not just convinced, some sort of like, logical argument or something like that. I don't know if that hopefully made sense along the way, but I just think that like the institution is like a big part of what's wrong with
Yeah. And
the belief.
in the sense of what I brought up earlier, the what the institution represents, at least when it comes to Christianity or Judaism or Islam, is the Orthodox view, or rather the denomination that's getting all the
It incorporates heresy while
attention.
denying heretics, like if that makes sense, like if I
Uh-huh.
could put it in sort of poetic way, because it's shaped by heresy and yet it would deny aberrations, you know, um, as a
I,
monolith, as a pretend monolith, right? Because we all know it's not a monolith. It's like the king has no clothes kind of thing, because like
uh-huh.
exclusivist doctrines is really what I'm referring to. I should
I,
probably
I just I just
say.
think it's important to be careful about how you put it like that and just say, well, the problem is we're not rigorously evaluating what it means to be a Christian. And I think
Right.
that
Yeah.
is where the postmodernist view, I think, is going to hold out, and I see a lot of promise with that, and I think it's just unfortunate. Like I think maybe there's a intent from the orthodoxy to kind of make it hard for the postmodernist view to be spread around and more well known, or maybe it's just coming about like within the past maybe 5 years, I would say. So it takes a while for things to kind of shape understanding of what it means to identify as a Christian, and in what ways we can interpret scripture, and not just what Christianity has to do.
I
uh
think that on Christianity, most interpretations of the truth as according to the Gospels are going to fail
sure.
because Christ is easy to throw under the bus because it's to incorporate that like heroic, vulnerable, doing your due diligence modality, which is the work, right? But like at the same time, the grace is also very much a part of that. That's what people I think we get on board with because I'm shown grace and I understand how that feels when I have the bulk of the community, the state, or even an individual has the right to demand
Mhm.
compensation from me because I've wronged them, but they instead show me grace. I know what that feels like. But it's to be vulnerable, to remove the obstructions such that you can pick up your cross and follow after
Mhm.
Christ, to perform that, like reciprocally, right, is another story. But they're two sides of the same coin. It's just to say, I think that is something that will
Yeah.
always be able to like it'll always be an elusive thing. I think it'll always be easy to lose that part of the message. So you're going to have theological frameworks like shaped by an aversion toward that. And I think that like even a multidisciplinary study won't tell you how empathy, really like works, right? Like 'cause I think that that's it's a human component that we bring to the table, right? So it's
Mhm.
tricky. I don't know if that helps at all, but that's to try to also clarify my position, and why I even struggle
Yeah.
to call myself a Christian, right?
Whether or not you label, whether or not you have the postmodernist or the classical framing of uh of spirituality.
Yeah.
I think ultimately, it's how we personalize and interpersonalize the gospel, how we carry our cross in relation to how Christ carried his cross, right? I think that's ultimately what the interpretation should come down to.
Yep.
It shouldn't matter what interpretation you identify with, whether it's, I'm not going to play favoritism here saying, you know what, people should be postmodernists. It's like,
No,
hey,
that's true because
if that's what works for you, that's what works for you. And that I
and
mentioned
we
in the
alluded to this just a
disclaimer.
moment ago, right? There's going to
Yeah.
be this strand that like it becomes so fine down to the level of an individual and what they take away from the Gospels has some relevancy and pertinence. And it's a hard thing to wrap your mind around because it is to say we can gather around this thing, but we also have to respect that there's at least some level, some layer, however thin you want to designate it. It's there of the individual's perspective, and we can learn from their perspective, right, and incorporate that into the larger bulk, if that makes sense. But I agree with you, and I think we were alluding to this earlier when we were talking about
Hmm.
how you look at this through this like group notion versus say like the more individual notion. So absolutely.
Yeah, it's like it's the group as well as the individual, and then the
Yeah.
ecology. It's the ecosystem that the group as well as the
Mm,
individual are existentially bound to as well.
right. Yeah.
And that's really getting. I mean, I would say that's more so leaning towards the postmodern framing. That's not to say that you can have a classical framing, but um, uh, I think this Casney brought this up earlier when he said, I have, this personal interpretation of what it means to be a Christian, and maybe that's what it really boils down to ultimately for most people, because there's not there this honest approach to a scholarly interpretation. It's not quite there yet. It's just this kind of like you have these institutions that represent the mainstream of the denominational authorities that, they have their interpretation, and most people are going to associate to, even if they don't even if they don't really associate to that interpretation, they just have a spiritual experience, and they say, oh, well, I identify as this because I had a pure spiritual experience. I don't really understand the dynamics of it, and and that's a different thing too. It's like, it's like, hey, I had an experience that compelled me to this system of ideals. And I think people should at least make the best commitment they can to investigate what those ideals are and whether or not they identify with a certain group that they're in. It doesn't necessarily have to be about their religion, but just anything they affiliate themselves to, right? So I think people, you know, in general, um should be more uh at least they more committed to like identifying that honestly for themselves, if they, based on, you know how they make sense of the world around them. It's not to say that they'll come to the same resolutions that we have, because they're going through their own uh trials and tribulations and journey. Although I do think that there's this personal and interpersonal, because we're even though we individually perceive the world around us, there's this collective consensus perception, because we're engaging with each other as well as the world around us, right? Um, I have brought up in some previous sessions about my interpretation of the Trinity and whatnot. I'm not going to get into that here, um, and I do have to kind of go. But next session, I want to kind of get into talking about, you know, I did a Bible study session that went over the autonomic nervous system and what happens with our brains as we pray. That's in session 5. I believe that's session 5. So I don't know if there's any other Bible study out that gets into the kind of like a neurotheology kind of spin, talking about, oh, this is what happens to your brain and your body when you pray. This is what's going on, and this is how it's affecting how you engage with the world around you. Um, that was interesting, but I think I want to do maybe it's the first ever recorded Bible study that did this whole neurological exploration of looking at like what it means to, for instance, looking at prayer, and there's other dynamics pertaining to spirituality that we can take into consideration. But this was one dynamic I thought was interesting because prayer has a lot to do with how we have hope and how we make, how that motivates our future interactions. And I think that's interesting, and that has a lot of implications into the dynamics of arousal. Um, and that was a really interesting session. But just to kind of do another kind of innovative Bible study spin, I kind of want to talk about artificial intelligence and technology and how motivating certain philosophies that, what we take from the gospel and what we take from not just Christianity but other faiths, and what that means, like how that implicates the prospects of like how we develop AI systems. So I think that'll be interesting. I wasn't sure if we would get into that this session. There was a number of things I wanted to talk about, but um, I appreciate you guys jumping on, and I'm not sure if Kasni had anything to share because we kind of been going on a back and forth, but
No, no,
I,
nothing for me.
okay. All right. Well, was there anything else you wanted to share before we end the session, Harlequin?
No, I appreciate the space, and I appreciate both of you. I do apologize if I started running on there, but absolutely would love to return and see what's coming up.
Great. All right. Take it easy, guys, and thanks for participating, and have a good one.